Okay, our last set of questions, particularly important, having to do with unwelcome and unexpected experiences. Again, think of this whole workshop as a kind of insurance policy so that if something happens that you'd rather not happen, does happen, you've thought about it in advance and have considered various ways of responding. Examples: requests for money, a request for a bribe so you can get in to do the research that you had in mind. You're welcome to come to the National Archives, but first we need $100 for that. What to do when you're in an uncomfortable physical or social space. Just something about the situation doesn't feel right. How do you extricate yourself from this? We're going to have some examples of this. This is particularly important, I think, for you to take mental notes, if not written notes, on how these situations arise and ways in which the panelists responded to them. All you.
So I had like a lot of uncomfortable experiences kind of related to being perceived as different. So catcalls or just unwanted attention, but nothing that I felt that I couldn't deal with or couldn't handle. There was just one situation though that did make me rather uncomfortable. I was in a pretty rural town that I wasn't familiar with, and I got there and there wasn't cell coverage and my contact didn't show up. So I was there without an interview, but I met someone who was working at a museum who offered to help me out. He knew a lot of local farmers that really fitted with the demographic that I was really interested in interviewing. However, he was offering to drive me around, so I was fairly concerned because I didn't know who this was. But since it was a small town, I was able to kind of do a little background check and make sure it was all right. I WhatsApped my family just to let them know where I was. And everything turned out great. I got these really great interviews. But the next day, I still didn't have my contact still was not around, so this person was being really helpful in getting me these other interviews. But on the way back that second day, we stopped at this small town's annual festival, which was really neat. There were a lot of local people around there, but I just started to feel in a position that I didn't really want to feel, getting a lot of really weird looks. My presence there wasn't really clarified as being a researcher. And I was just getting really uncomfortable with the fact that I couldn't really control my situation. I didn't have cell coverage, I didn't have transportation, and I didn't like feeling indebted to this person, as it's really difficult to figure out really good ways to reimburse people in a socially acceptable way. So I had looked up the bus schedule beforehand and had all my stuff ready, and I managed to make it to the bus station and get back to a town that I was a lot more comfortable with and familiar with to kind of regroup. So I would just advise that just always clarify what your research is for, and this was an example of things turning out all right, even if your plans didn't come out as you had expected them to, but just always kind of have an escape strategy, and if you're not feeling comfortable with the situation, just get out of it. Yeah.
So I guess two specific anecdotes, both within probably 2 hours of arriving in Senegal. The first was I had no grasp on the relative value of the currency, which was, in hindsight, a pretty dumb move. So the first thing would be, this probably is seemingly obvious to everyone but me, but before you land, have an idea of what, one West African franc or 1 rupee is or something like that. Because when I arrived and was driven to the hotel, I just, it was basically extortion how much the cab driver charged me. And then the second was basically after I'd settled into my room, the concierge called up and asked if I wanted a prostitute to come up to my room, as if it was kind of part of the usual hotel package. And so obviously I declined and handled the situation with as much maturity as I could. But so things like that, I think it's important, returning to this idea of cultural sensitivity, not to necessarily act overtly offended, but just as politely as possible decline either a request for a bribe or some sort of other offer. And then the other kind of unpleasant experience was just transportation and flying in general. It was a pretty stressful element of the trip, I guess, was taking these West African airlines from one country to another. And obviously the airports and the security process aren't as systematic as they are here in the US, and so that was obviously very frustrating. But at a certain point, you just kind of have to resign yourself to it. Obviously be attentive and aware, but there's nothing that I could do that would change the security system at the airport in Ouagadougou. So I just kind of had to go along with it.
Yeah, I would just say, depending on where you are, like as people become more comfortable with your presence, they're less conscious of your comfort in local areas. I learned fairly quickly that I look South African. I didn't know that before I got there, but like people would come up to me specifically and just be like, "You look like you're South African." So when I was working with a lot of activists, they would eventually, once they got to know me, they'd be like, "Oh yeah, take a minibus to this township, bring your video camera, we'll meet you in like an hour or whatever, and we'll go from there." And I found myself in positions where, I didn't know where I was going, and as Nicole said, like I didn't have control over the transportation I was taking, and I had a very expensive video camera. But there's this sort of sense that, like, I don't know, if I had all my footage on my camera, if I had lost it, I wouldn't be able to afford another one, where people probably wouldn't think, you're American, you can just afford to get another one. Or you look like you can hang, so, we won't really worry about that. And I had to tell them I was uncomfortable just taking the bus. I ended up going the next day and I drove. And, I got there and they met me like an hour and a half later. So I was sitting on the side of the road with my friend, like, waiting for them to come, and I realized if I had taken a minibus and got off with a nice camera and tried to ask someone directions, they realized I was American, then it would have been a pretty uncomfortable situation. So part of it is kind of just anticipating what your comfort is and like being proactive about what you want to do and what you're going to do instead of what people expect you to do. That makes sense.
For me, I don't know that there were so much unwanted or unwelcome experiences as I was acutely aware of money in the cultural context. Probably being from there and having family streams that are both working class and elite, the tension between the two is just really palpable. And so I found in both cases when I went to do research that I would end up leaving my personal non-grant discretionary funds there. And so I'm a poor student in America, but while I'm there, I'm just thinking, oh my goodness, it's just such a completely different context. And so just recognizing, okay, I'm gonna leave this money behind and plan to do that next time. So that's sort of more of what I experience when I'm in that context.
I felt really sick near the end of my 2 months in Uganda. I was in a city, could be qualified to kind of a large town more like, and was diagnosed with malaria despite taking malaria prophylaxis. And I thought, great, I'll be better in 3 days after taking treatment. It turned out that was not the case. I didn't have malaria. I will never know what I had, but it destroyed me. So about a week into it, not having eaten or really had a sip of water because I couldn't keep anything down, I finally got transport back to the capital city, and I just had to come home early. It was really expensive. I tried to communicate with international health insurance. I had signed up for a whole bunch of different programs. I had my ISIC card, I had my international SOS, but communication was tough. At one point where I was sick, the electricity went out. I couldn't recharge my cell phone. I couldn't get more minutes. And so I could have done a way better job there, and maybe these international medical insurers could have helped me return home more safely, and I also could have paid a little bit less out of pocket. But yeah, it kind of goes on with what Matt was saying. The chances of getting sick are real, but I never felt like my life was imperiled, but it was a time to come home, and that was unfortunate.
Okay. Any other thing? Just a few other reactions, and then we'll open things up to the panel before we close the panel down and everything down for the first session. Several of you mentioned transportation. It's always a good idea to check on what you can find out about the safety of a bus line, or you never know, but sometimes certain ways of transportation are unsafe as well as not very well known. Always good to have a backup plan. If this particular route doesn't work, then you're always thinking about backups. What is the thing that you could do if your plan doesn't work? Also, to turn back to an earlier theme about this summer as learning about yourself. We're talking here about an uncomfort zone, a situation where you haven't experienced it before and there's something about it that makes you feel uncomfortable or not fully in control and you want to be in control. This is where you're learning about yourself, that uncomfort zone. It's very useful overall to have a diary and to keep notes about what you like, what you don't like, things that you might want to say that you can't say, for example, about politics, but also about, today I felt very uncomfortable about situation X. And that is an important thing to reflect upon when the summer has come to an end. You've just learned something about what doesn't work for you. A couple of thoughts about being asked for a bribe, because you, after all, are American, or they think you're made of money. Many of these people are poor. They've asked others for bribes, they've received them. One possibility is to say, I'm sorry, I can't do that, but I'd love to take you to lunch tomorrow and to be my guest. In other words, you have an alternative to the bribe, you're spending a little bit of money. This gives you actually a chance to talk with the person and have even a pleasant learning experience rather than handing over the money in order to get a privilege. So think of alternative ways to avoid embarrassing yourself, but also to avoid embarrassing the other person. To be told no is not pleasant. You might also decide to bring along a friend in situations that are embarrassing or awkward. And the person isn't going to ask you for a bribe if you have a local person who's a friend who's standing right next to you. You can also do this during interview situations if you don't want to be propositioned or whatever. Think in advance of what might happen. Somebody going along with you can be, in a sense, a very important source of protection. We'll conclude with asking the panelists if they have any other additional thoughts, either prepared or that came up in the course of the conversation they'd like to share with us, and then we'll close things out. Anybody like to add some things?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's important to keep in mind, and this is something that I'm really glad that my thesis advisor told me before going, was, ultimately this is either a senior undergraduate thesis or some sort of public service opportunity or perhaps a paid fellowship. You should take it seriously, and you should certainly obviously use the money that you've been given, that you've been fortunate enough to receive from Stanford wisely. But you shouldn't feel guilty about exploring the country a little bit or discovering things about the country. And so this is an impulse that I had when I was doing research was, I only did 4 interviews today. That's not enough. I need to push myself harder and schedule a 5th or something like that. You don't need to be working 12 or 13-hour days. So there were a couple days where, for my own mental sanity, I went to the beach in Senegal. And that was great. And I don't think you need to feel guilty about doing that. Obviously, don't misuse the funds you've been given. But at the same time, this should be a life experience above all else. So enjoy it, I guess.
And I think one concluding remark that I have is to keep an open mind and don't expect things to go well. So I've had a lot of abroad experiences, and I know that no matter how much I prepare, no matter how much I know what to expect, something always doesn't go right. So just expect that your bags are going to be missing when you land in your country. Expect that you might get sick from this new food that you've been so excited to try. And so just keep an open mind, and once something actually does happen, you'll be like, haha, I predicted that. So it'll be cool.
Something Kareem said during the last break to me jogged a thought. He was speaking to privilege, and I was just reminded that on the day that I led my workshop in St. Lucian, it was a day-long event that the evaluations actually said was entirely too short. I found myself standing in front of the room being really, really humbled when I looked out at these people who'd come from their jobs and from busy lives to come and sit and have that conversation. And Kareem had talked about privilege, and I just would like to say this is a huge privilege to be able to go and have these kinds of experiences.
This in terms of, this was my summer research project. This is a really intense academic thing that I want to pursue. But I also think about like what's going to come out of it academically versus personally. I think I got a lot more out of it personally through growth than I probably contributed to the academic literature. It was probably the most, I don't know, formative experience of my life, formative summer that I've had so far. And just the opportunity, like you said, to introspect a little bit and reflect. I found myself thinking way more about home than I had ever anticipated, kind of comparing the experiences that I'd had in Argentina with experiences that I'd had with my grandparents or something. So that was probably the biggest thing that I got out of it besides the academic part, was just thinking more about what I value with my family, about home. So, yeah.
Yeah, not to be repetitive, but the best piece of advice I received was, like, not only don't feel guilty about indulging in travel, but go out of your way. Like, if you're in a country that you've never been before, like, you have access to other areas. Like, I went to Zimbabwe to Victoria Falls, and I think I learned more from that 8-day travel experience than I have from anything. I've used that, you know, in academically in papers I've written about Zimbabwe. I'm like, whoa, I actually went there and saw that they had used American money. That was crazy, trying to use that, or like interacting with people. It's just not an opportunity that many people have. So if you're in a specific region, make sure to at least visit one other place that isn't part of your research, just for your knowledge and experience.
For me, one of the big takeaways was just that the relationships I built really lasted beyond the summer. Flying back from Amsterdam back to the US, I was sitting next to someone who turned out to be Ugandan, and I had worked with his wife all summer long. I met a professor when I studied abroad in Cape Town who had a sibling who worked in the government agency I was collaborating with. It was crazy, these experiences that made me realize, sounds cheesy, but what a small world it is. So the experience isn't going to end when you return home. I mean, I guess you can hear we've all been thinking a lot about it on experiences we had up to 9 months ago. But it can cause you to kind of reevaluate your life here and maybe inspire a new intellectual path or serve as the basis for new friendships that could last far beyond your summer. So really excited for everyone here.
These were wonderful comments from the panel. Let me just be selective and reinforce a comment that Louise made. We can't control the situations that we'll experience, but in some ways we have a lot of control over our expectations. If we set the expectations too high, we almost guarantee that we'll end up the summer feeling badly, that we didn't do enough, they didn't do enough for us, etc. Whereas if you set your expectations a little bit too low, then you'll end up saying, wow, today was a good day. I got 4 interviews instead of I only got 4 interviews. And so it seems to me in life in general, but certainly for this summer, it's good to set the expectations realistically, minus 10%. And then you'll end up feeling quite good about the day, about the summer, about Stanford, about this weather, etc. Thanks to the panel, and glad you were here.